It's been a year since the Taliban took power in Afghanistan. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will look at what has changed for the Afghanistan people, for good or for worse, especially the lives of the Afghan women, the Afghan girls, more restrictions they face in their everyday lives. We will look at all that and what it means to Afghanistan's neighbors and what can we do there. We will also look at other neighbors like Sri Lanka, the crisis there, the China-Taiwan tension that is still on. And of course, Foreign Minister Jaishankar is on a three-nation trip to Latin American countries. What does it mean for India? What are the possibilities there? All that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. Welcome to this episode. We start with 1 year of the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. It was 15th of August last year, Harsh, that the Taliban took over. There has been no formal recognition of Taliban, but nobody really had much hope there. But when we look at Afghanistan now, what is the situation that you see? The girls are not going to school. The women face more restriction. There is poverty. There is, again, the same kind of chaos that the Afghan people had fought against. The world right now has kind of forgotten Afghanistan. Your comments on that?
Yes, it has been a year, but it seems very, very long period of time, especially I think for the Afghans who at least were hoping for a better life. There was some sense of optimism before, but with the Taliban coming back, I think two things have happened. One, all the assumptions that I think some of the Western countries had made, that this is going to be a new Taliban, that this is going to be somewhere this is going to be an important inflection point in the way the Taliban look at themselves, look at their ideology, look at their engagement with the world. I think all of those assumptions have not really come to fruition, and this was something that I think countries like India were warning against. And this is exactly what has happened. We have seen no particular interest in the Taliban to change their ways, whether it pertains to women's rights, minority rights, or a broader human rights situation in the country, or whether it means changing their ideological makeup, ideological thinking, their support for groups like, some of them have been named like Al-Qaeda, for example. We saw Al-Zawahiri being killed, living right at the heart of Kabul. So there have been, episodes over the last year that should disabuse us, if there are any, of the notion that this is going to be a new phase in Taliban's evolution. And I think that is particularly, I think, the dismal aspect of this rather sorry state of affairs that we are witnessing. But the other side has been that, look, now Taliban are in power, and there is no, as you were mentioning, there are so many crises in the world that hardly anyone is focusing on Afghanistan. And that is also very unfortunate, because at the end of the day, the humanitarian crisis that Afghanistan is facing is a huge one. And so the onus will be on regional countries to help support the ordinary Afghans in navigating their way through this crisis. And which means that it is inevitable that you have to deal with Taliban as the governing authority. And I think that's the reason why we have also seen in countries like India that have been very critical of the Taliban now beginning to engage Taliban to see that the aid, that the support that we are sending is actually going to the people that should be going to. So ultimately, this is also about being a bit pragmatic and seeing that the help that you want to give to ordinary Afghans is reaching them. And also from a geopolitical point of view, I think it's, for a country like India, it is important that other countries do not make Afghanistan a playground for their geopolitical ambitions. So you need to be aware of what other countries are doing. And unfortunately, most countries have seemed to be more interested in gaining geopolitical advantage in the space that the Taliban have created in Afghanistan, than in doing anything substantial for either helping helping the ordinary Afghans, or building capacity in Afghanistan that can lead to a more sustained economic and political project emerging in Afghanistan. So I think largely, as we look back at the last year, the situation is grim. There is no government to talk of in Afghanistan, and increasingly we saw, for example, very recently, women, despite the threat from the Taliban, they came out on the streets, they protested, and I think that speaks to the inherent resilience of ordinary Afghans who want to protest, who are now coming out, and it's inevitable that at some point the international community will have to take a serious look and see what they can potentially do in Afghanistan. But at the moment, the last 1 year, has gone by without much changing on the ground for ordinary Afghans.
So not much has changed, but we can definitely say that Afghanistan has actually fallen very far behind. And anything specific that the neighborhood countries can do here?
Well, I think the most important thing at the moment is to ensure that the gains of the last several decades, when there was an attempt to build capacity, there was an attempt to build institutions in the country, are actually those gains. Some of those gains are maintained. It's a very tough task, but I think at the end of the day, the only way in which in which Afghanistan this project in Afghanistan can work, if there is if there is a government in Kabul that tries to become inclusive, that becomes more receptive to the demands of various stakeholders, and that is willing to live with the neighborhood in a way that does not impinge on the security of its neighbors. And I think those essential questions mean that the neighboring countries will have to continue to shape their relationship with the Taliban, because that's the governing authority, in a way that keeps them under check, that keeps them the target remains that ultimately the aid, the support that we are giving to Afghanistan is contingent on Taliban adhering to certain red lines. And that, I think, is a very difficult task, but I think that is something that we are constantly now being reminded is very important. If you see UN reports, they talk of Taliban's continued engagement with terror and extremist groups. If you see what Americans have done as counter-terror operations in killing al-Zawahiri, we know that there are individuals and groups that are operating freely in Afghanistan. That should not be the case. If you look at the economic situation, we know that there is hardly any economic governance to talk about. The political structures are crumbling. Taliban cannot run Afghanistan as an ideological state, because Afghanistan is much diverse, much varied, and the stakeholders are many who would be willing to stand up to Taliban if the requirements are such. So I think that the problems that Afghanistan is facing at the moment are at multiple ends, and the neighboring countries should be willing to help ordinary Afghans in this time of crisis, but at the same time keeping Taliban on a tight leash, because that's where you get the delivery from. But I think the challenge at the moment is that in the neighboring countries and the global powers, all of them have so many crises to think of. There are multiple crises that are brewing in the Indo-Pacific, in Eurasia, that the appetite for doing something substantive with regard to Afghanistan is whittling down. And I think that's a real challenge, and that's a real danger, that if you take your eyes off the ball from Afghanistan, then eventually it may come back to haunt you.
And that is what seems to be happening. Like you rightly said, there are too many crises around the world that the world powers are dealing with right now, and the focus has kind of shifted from Afghanistan. Another neighbor, Sri Lanka, has been under, reeling under economic crisis, and there are dire situations there. Again, ordinary people on the streets protesting a corrupt government that was toppled. But look at the situation in Sri Lanka. But at that moment, Harsh, we also saw, initially China was nowhere to be seen, but then recently we saw that a Chinese ship was docking at a Sri Lanka port, and that raised serious security concerns. But the ship has gone after about 6 days, but India raised the security concerns, and rightly so. Sri Lanka, but is in a situation where it is seeking a bailout package sooner the better. At that moment, it's very difficult for Sri Lanka to not really give in to Chinese demands. So the pressure on Sri Lanka is increasing, and India's concerns, of course, are there. But how can this be balanced out? The Chinese vessel, docking the Chinese vessel there was very crucial. China's approval is very crucial for Sri Lanka right now for its bailout too.
Yes, indeed. It's very ironic, Naghma, as you point out, that Sri Lanka was China was nowhere to be seen during the large part of the Sri Lankan crisis, and people were really distressed. People needed help. Ordinary Sri Lankans needed help, and China simply, slipped away from the radar. And now, to make a point about its growing strategic prowess at this particular juncture is particularly disturbing, because it means that all China cares about are its strategic ambitions, even at a time when Sri Lanka is going through a terrible crisis. This is a crisis, once in a lifetime crisis, one of the most significant in its post-independent history. There is, even as we speak, there is no light at the end of the tunnel, and the dangers are in fact growing. And at this particular point in time, to have its ship dock there and to make it a point of prestige, because Sri Lanka did request China to defer it. They did ask China to reconsider it, because they realize that this is, they are becoming, they are coming in this, they're becoming part of this wider geopolitical game that China is playing in the Indian Ocean region. So Sri Lankan policymakers are aware of what is happening, but unfortunately, their situation is such that they need China at the end of the day. They need, and China knows that China may not have helped them at the time of crisis, but China has deep pockets. So as Sri Lanka tries to come out of the economic problems that it is facing, China will be a partner, and they cannot simply go to China and say, please don't come here. So I think to make this a point of prestige at this point betrays in some ways also China's insecurity. And this insecurity comes from the fact, Naghma, that India has been at the forefront of of lending its helping hand to Sri Lanka at a time when China was nowhere in the picture, at a time when very few other actors were there. India kept Sri Lankan, the interests of ordinary Sri Lankans at the heart of its policy, and engaged Sri Lanka very, very substantively. And there was certainly a shift in the mood as far as India is concerned, in terms of what India has been able to deliver, if you look at the statements from the policy elites as well as from ordinary Sri Lankans. So I think there was a sense that India was getting its Sri Lanka policy right, that India's engagement with Sri Lanka was on robust grounds. And then I think in some ways also unnerved China, because the narrative was becoming that, look, China was nowhere to be seen, and India is the country that is coming to the aid of Sri Lanka. And somewhere then to come out of that and to make this a point of prestige, to make this a point of to have this ship dock in Hambantota port at this particular point. And again, Hambantota has a certain history. Hambantota has a certain resonance in Sri Lanka. It was a major project of Rajapaksa's, Mahinda Rajapaksa's. It was a major port project that has not yielded any dividends. It had become a white elephant, and therefore Sri Lanka had to lease it to China on a 99. They had to give it to China on a 99-year lease. So there is a history there, and I think that betrays a sense of nervousness in China about what is happening in Sri Lanka, how they are being perceived. And I think how India is being received in Sri Lanka. So
Yes.
while in the short term it may seem that, look, China may have gotten its way, it's a big challenge to India, which it is. I think what China is demonstrating is that its footprint in the Indian Ocean region is expanding. But I think it's also about China's own sense of nervousness about what is happening in Sri Lanka, and how what has happened in Sri Lanka in the last few years will impact the image of China in Sri Lanka.
But China is also rattled with India's statement over Taiwan, though India has not changed its stand on the one China policy as far as Taiwan is concerned. But India, after years of restraint, has actually publicly articulated its concerns about the Chinese unilateralism, and that also seems to have rattled China. But how do you see that affecting the India-China? I mean, China's stand on Jammu Kashmir, China's stand on many other issues where India is concerned. Now, India voicing its concerns publicly over Taiwan. How do you think it's going to affect their equation?
I think India's statement was long overdue, and I think it doesn't change much as far as China is concerned, because China, in any case, does not follow one India policy. So, if so, I think what India is reminding China is that, look, while technically India considers one China as part of its broader policy framework, but there is no guarantee that India will continue with it, because there are questions around China's own policy towards India. After all, foreign policy is about reciprocity. It's not a one-way street. So unless China is willing to consider Indian interests, China is willing to be sensitive to Indian security interests and to Indian sensitivities on the border, unless China is willing to move forward to solve some of the fundamental problems that challenge China Sino-Indian relationship, I don't think India has any incentive to reiterate its one China policy, as China seems to be demanding now from many other countries. And many other countries have reiterated one China policy. But let's remember that India has not reiterated one China policy for almost more than a decade now, because India's concern has been that China is not following the reciprocity in this matter. So unless China also acknowledges that the concerns about what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir or in Arunachal or in Sikkim, which China continues to rake up time and time again, unless China makes a change in that posture, I think India will continue to make this a point, and to come out and say that, look, China unilaterally changing status quo through the use of force is a problem that had to be reiterated, because that's a problem not that Taiwan is facing, but that's a problem that India is also facing. And that's a problem, excuse me, that's a problem that Southeast Asian countries are also facing.
Yes.
So there is a broader narrative here about China's assertiveness, China's aggression, and that I think India and other countries should be willing to highlight. And I think India has done, in the case of Taiwan, this statement has come at the right time to remind China that India will also take up these issues, given the kind of relation, given the stasis in the relationship that India-China is facing. And we know that Dr. Jaishankar is talking explicitly about the problems that they are facing, and how this is perhaps one of the worst phases in Sino-Indian relationship.
Absolutely. So after maintaining years of restraint there, India has, like you said, it was long overdue. India has articulated its concern over the development in the Taiwan Strait too. And Dr. Jaishankar is also on a 3-day visit. Before we wrap up this episode of the Ideas Factory, Harsh, the significance of that visit, these countries, this visit, he's going to Brazil, Paraguay and Argentina, and there's a lot to tap there in terms of trade and investment.
There's a lot to tap there, certainly, and I think Latin America is something that we always consider very far, and in terms of our foreign policy engagement. But I think in this day and age, Latin America should be a priority, and this is Dr. Jaishankar's first visit to South America, and I think Paraguay, where he is going, this India is opening an embassy there for the first time, so that's also a welcome move. To have greater presence, greater footprint diplomatic footprint in Latin America is most welcome. It's a region that remains dominated, primarily by the US, but we have seen in recent years how China has made its moves there. And what is also interesting is how Brazil and India's position on Russia, buying oil from Russia, are also very identical. Just like India wants good deals for Indian citizens, Brazil's president has also said very similar things, that they would continue to buy oil from Russia despite Western pressure, because they would like to do what's best for the countrymen and women. So I think there is that convergence in terms of the broader worldview, that you don't want to be part of this larger global these two camps that are emerging in global politics, and how can middle powers like India, Brazil, and Argentina frame their responses is going to be an important conversation.
Sure.
And just as an aside, Argentina is very interested in joining BRICS, for example. So I think it would be an interesting conversation to have as to what role India sees for Argentina in BRICS, and of course what role Brazil sees for Argentina in BRICS. So I think things are eh, being shaped by the larger geopolitical forces, and India, given its emphasis on trade and technology cooperation with other countries, would certainly find that Latin America is a territory that needs to be explored more and engaged with more.
Yes, absolutely. So that's what this visit is aiming at, to explore Latin America a lot more in terms of engagements, in terms of trade and investment. Thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh, and thank you all for watching. That's it from us on this episode of the IGS Factory.